Good evening. Welcome to Beyond the Surface, exploring the influence between healthy relationships and physical, emotional, social, mental, and spiritual wellness. We are here this evening with a fabulous group of panelists with very unique expertise. We're very excited to host this panel this evening. We are here and participating in a Facebook live stream event on behalf and hosted by Farmington Safe Suicide Awareness for Everyone. You'll hear a little bit more information about that later. And I'm going to pass it off to Dr. Robin Floyd, who's going to start us off this evening. Thank you.
Good evening. So we're going to go around and introduce ourselves. I am Dr. Robin Floyd. I am a mental health nurse leader at Detroit VA Hospital. Also, I am a mental health, behavioral health, and psychiatry professor at University of Detroit Mercy.
And my name is Dr. Kevin Scott. I also am a Marine Corps veteran. My background is in the VA. I specialize in mental health with a cognitive and traumatology, and I'm happy to be here.
Yes, good evening, everyone. By way of introduction, my name is Chaplain Jamel Dorset. I am the clinical mental health chaplain for the Department of Veteran Affairs with experience in sub-use as well, substance use.
I'm Dr. Tamina Shakir. I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist and assistant clinical professor at Wayne State.
I'm Olivia Ray Leonard. I'm the Prevention Education Manager with Haven of Oakland County. And my area of expertise, of course, is prevention education, also working with survivors in the legal system and incarcerated survivors.
Right, awesome. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. We are overjoyed to bring this community conversation to you on this evening with the title of Beyond the Surface, exploring the influence between healthy relationships and physical, emotional, social, mental, and spiritual wellness. There has been a devastating increase of domestic violence cases in Michigan and the U.S. The spotlight of these cases have been illustrated on various social media platforms and in the news locally and nationally. Many times we do not realize how negative experiences impact our 5 dimensions of health: mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually, and socially. So right now, we're gonna take a moment of silence for those that have been affected by domestic violence and those family members as well. And thank you. Okay, so right now we'd like to share some very important statistics regarding domestic violence. In Michigan, domestic violence affects 1 in 3 families. Nearly 1 in 4 adult women and approximately 1 in 7 adult men have experienced severe physical violence from an intimate partner in their lifetime. Nearly 3 in 10 women and 1 in 10 men in the U.S. have experienced rape, physical violence, and or stalking by a partner. 43% of domestic violence incidents result in serious injuries. 70.7% are women and 71.1% of the offenders are men. In Michigan, more than 100 people die each year from domestic violence. Firearms are the leading cause of death in domestic violence incidents. Domestic violent crimes account for more than 40% of police calls. The most dangerous time for a woman is being battered is when she leaves. 75% of the women who are killed by their partners are murdered after the relationship is over or as it ends. Only 20% of survivors of domestic abuse end up filing for a restraining order of protection. So now I would like to ask some questions and give a moment of reflection. What is your vision of a partner in a healthy relationship? Do you feel safe in your relationship? What does that mean for you? What does being safe means what? Safe enough to express yourself freely, disagree, to say no if you feel uncomfortable or not interested in doing something. Lastly, what is your deal breaker in the relationship if it becomes unhealthy? Let's look at some healthy traits that as women we should consider when choosing to be in a relationship. And now I'm going to speak from the woman perspective. The first, mutual respect, valuing each other's opinions, beliefs, and feelings without hostility. What does that mean to you when you're in a relationship when it comes to your respect? Secondly, the trait of communication, speaking in a calm tone, even during times of challenges or disagreements, providing a platform to listen and not to interrupt, to listen to understand and not necessarily to respond. And as we know, sometimes that can be very challenging. The next trait of honesty. Sometimes this can be challenging. However, we must be truthful to avoid increased frustration and hostility. The next trait, how you feel supported. As we know, life is difficult. Life is challenging. Life is hard sometimes. Is your partner willing to be that listening ear, that shoulder to cry on, or that word of wisdom when you need them? And next, our independence. Is your partner receptive to days that you want to be alone? And as we know, sometimes we need our alone time. Or is it okay for you to be with a friend or a family member without causing increased hostility or an argument? The next, reflection on goals, establishing healthy boundaries, personal goals, relationship goals. What does that mean with your partner? Sometimes we have different relationship goals. That's at the time that you really need to have an open conversation because sometimes we have different goals. Uh, you might feel like you want to be married one day. Your partner might feel like they just want to be in a committed relationship. So that's the time that you really need to know what is the future goal. Is it an area of compromise or is it a deal breaker? The next trait is trust, the ability to feel comfortable with your partner together in various environments and when you are apart. So the trust of could you go to an event and you're at an event with various other ladies, or sometimes would you feel comfortable with your partner going on by themselves? Would you trust them to just be in an environment without you? As a woman in a healthy relationship, you should feel comfortable and safe. You should feel cherished, loved, provided affection, always in a state of growth, appreciated, valued, with anticipation that there is always work to do. Healthy relationships continue to develop. The amount of effort that is put in together as teammates can provide the catalyst to a healthy relationship. As a woman, know when to leave when it becomes unhealthy. Seek resources. Do not compromise your respect, dignity, and most importantly, your self esteem. Always create healthy boundaries. And now I'm going to pass on the torch to my partner, Dr. Scott.
Wow, there's a lot there, a lot to unpack. You've touched on so many things, but I think when you look at it from a male's perspective, there are so many things that come into bringing a healthy environment to any relationship. I think a lot of times when the relationship gets conscrewed or it goes into a very deleterious atmosphere is because we as men may place status on our partners that don't belong, i.e., you can't marry your mother. So therefore, it's unfortunate and it's unfair to make that individual take on the role of your mother. I think another thing that we have to understand, excuse me, as men, that our helpmeet, when we meet this individual who we want to take that vow and go to the next step with, that they have to be are equal. A lot of times that financial dynamic can upset the scales. I know some men have a problem with their mate making more money than them. So that is an adjustment. And then there's the roles in that relationship. Let's face it, a healthy, strong, striving relationship is work. It is something that once the honeymoon period is over, then you truly understand that you're living with an individual. You have to understand that that person is their own person. They have their own idiosyncrasies, for good or for bad, for better or for worse. Those are the vows that we took. And unfortunately, because we live in such an instant self-gratification society, that if it hits the turbulence, if you would, we're ready to abandon ship. We're ready to go through the next drive-through window and order another Happy Meal. Well, it just doesn't work like that. Well, it shouldn't work like that, should I say. But unfortunately, it does. Another thing that I've learned in my marriage is that the man does not have to carry all of the burden in a relationship. Society has at sometimes put unfair pressure on a man to be the ultimate breadwinner. You have to bring home the bacon. You have to do this. You have to be the protector and all this. Well, in that process, oftentimes we can't express our vulnerability, our fears, our struggles. So when you have that individual that you can share that with, who's going to be there to lift you up when you need to be lifted, to stroke your back when you need to be stroked, but also sometimes, to give you that, that pep talk, like, come on, let's go ahead and do this. So, and I was listening to your statistics, and I would be remiss not to mention this. I was going to wait, but I think it does need to be stated. And I'm going to preface this by saying this for men and women, that when you get into a situation that becomes unhealthy, you have to have enough love for yourself to seek remedy for whatever that remedy looks like. There's a lot of other things that I could get into as far as what healthy relationships look like. Trust, you talked about trust. Dr. Floyd, that's big. If you can't go on your own, have your own life, everybody needs space alone. That's that synergy that helps that relationship grow. And when you do it right, when it's done collectively, when it's done in concert, when the two are truly knitted, it makes for a beautiful relationship. I personally feel, in my personal opinion, that the institution of marriage, in my personal opinion, is one of the greatest things that you can experience. So I'll leave it right there for right now. I'll park that car right there.
Thank you so much, Drs. Floyd and Dr. Scott, for giving us your perspective on key points from a couple's perspective, male and female. We really appreciate that. We are going to pass the baton over to Dr. Shakir, and she is gracing us with her knowledge around trauma-induced behavior in unhealthy relationships. Dr. Shakir?
Yeah. So thank you for this opportunity. I will start by talking about what really is interpersonal trauma or interpersonal violence. And interpersonal violence is really intentional use of force against another person. It can be your spouse, it can be children, it can be anybody else or a group of people. Okay. So in our conversation today, we are specifically focusing on domestic violence and intimate partner violence or partner violence. And that can have many different forms in which violent behavior is exhibited. It can be physical violence, it can be emotional abuse, it can be sexual trauma, which is inflicted towards the partner. It can be neglect even. It doesn't have to be abuse, but many times it can be neglect. And that can affect the relationship pretty significantly. One thing to remember is that when there is partner violence and there are, it doesn't just stay between these two people who are in a relationship. It goes way beyond that. Just think about children in that same household and how they're affected and what kind of long-term effects that watching that violence and being subjected to that violence can do to them. It affects the whole community. Okay, it doesn't just stay in a household. It has a ripple effect and can lead to not just affecting the immediate community, but also generations. When we look at generation after generation after generation of trauma. So I'm gonna spend maybe a little bit of time on what really makes a healthy relationship. A healthy relationship is a mutual relationship. It's not just the individual, but the unit itself. Whether it is a man and a woman, whether it is people of the same gender, or however you describe your relationship to be with your partner. And that is, there is communication in a healthy relationship. There is trust. There is that trust that no matter what happens, my partner has his or her back. I have my back. They have my back, and I'm there to support them. There is a certain level of equality, and equality doesn't mean I'm going to pay 50% rent and you pay 50% rent. What it is really mutually working together so that you can have a life. Okay. Sometimes it does happen that one partner may fulfill more of the financial responsibilities and the other one is taking care of the home. If everybody starts earning and making six figures, who's going to clean the house? So that is where really mutual respect and mutual partnership come. And this is really a partnership that goes beyond 9 to 5. It is for long term. And really what it boils down to is enjoying each other's in that space. Does that mean that we don't want a vacation from our partners from time to time? Absolutely. Sometimes we all need a break, not just because your partner is abusive, but because we're human beings, bottom line. So what really makes then an abusive relationship? It is really a lack of a healthy relationship where there's lack of trust, there's doubt, there's fear, there's disrespect. I'm not respecting my partner as another human being. That is what makes it. That is where it really starts out, where I'm putting a label on my partner that this is their role, this is their label. I have worked with women who have been labels put on them. Oh, your mom is just having a bipolar moment, or oh, your mom is just having her PMS, where a father or may talk like that to the children, and where now the children are putting that label on their mother. The same thing may happen the other way around, because it's not like women cannot be abusive. There are women who can show similar kind of disrespect and abuse towards their partner. All right. And that is where then the family unit starts disintegrating and breaking. Because when there's no respect, it's not a unit anymore. It's like tug of war. We are pulling at each other. And then what do? You're constantly bickering. You're constantly negative. You're not even in the right state of mind to maintain a healthy relationship. Or even it's no longer healthy, maintain a relationship. And that is where then, of course, children in the home are now getting affected. And other people in the home are getting affected. Okay. Other types of abuse that we many times see in dysfunctional partnerships, including domestic violence, is where we see coercion or pressuring the partner into doing something they may not be willing to do. Sometimes it may involve financial gains, and sometimes it may involve forcing the partner to get away from the family and friends. So it's like you create a situation where your partner has nobody else to turn to but you. And that is many times where that helplessness starts, where you just don't have anybody to go to. Your children don't have anybody to go to. You start losing. I mean, of course, you're not returning your friends' calls. Your friends, instead of wondering what may be going on, may stop calling you. So the same thing with family. How many parties are you going to miss before your family is going to stop inviting you? And that is what ends up happening in that isolation of an abusive relationship, where people around you who probably can be a support system for you isolate you, because you just don't have the strength to tell them what's going on. So that brings me to a term that many times we use, which is called trauma bonding, where slowly but surely it doesn't develop overnight. It happens over time, where an abusive relationship, slowly but surely, with isolation, with that disrespect, with what we call gaslighting, where there is a constant blame game going on, it ends up happening that you become so alone. And that is how it starts, where you develop this very unhealthy bond with the person who's abusing you, to the point where you're not just giving explanations to their behavior or about their behavior, you just are stuck. Okay, so many times people who do work with individuals who've been abused, adults who've been abused, they wonder that, oh, but how many times do I have to tell this person to leave their spouse? How many times will you have broken bones before you gotta leave your spouse? It's not that easy. I mean, think about it this way: no matter how many bones are broken, this is the only home I have, and this is the only person I can go to. How am I gonna leave? And and I have made this, now this unhealthy bond where I don't even think I can survive without this person. Abuse has become a life for me, or a reality every day for me. I'm just going to touch on a couple of other reasons why some people may not feel comfortable leaving an abusive relationship. One of them is, of course, financial dependency. Okay. I may have a degree and I may be working prior to my marriage, or relationship, but let's say now I don't have a job. For the past 5 years, I have spent taking care of my children in the household at home, and now I'm in this abusive relationship. I don't even have the confidence to look for another job. So there's this financial dependency that sometimes happens in these relationships, that you just don't know if you can make it outside of this relationship. Sometimes the emotions. How many times do we try to convince ourselves, I'm going to fix this? This is my child's parent. This is my partner. How many times do we tell ourselves, I'm going to fix this. I can do it. It just happened because he was drunk. It just happened because he was mad at his friend, or his boss was rude to him. How many times do we give that explanation? Because really that is not the explanation for our partner, but that's an explanation to us. Sort of like a Band-Aid we keep on putting on ourselves, saying, yeah, this is why I chose to stay tonight. I'm still healing from the fracture, but this is why I chose, because he ultimately loves me. And no matter what he does, he comes back to me. So, oh well. One of the things I do want to point out is cultural. What are some of the cultural reasons? Okay. Some cultures, more than others, are not accepting of breaking a relationship. Okay. And sometimes in some cultures, once the woman especially is married, that is it. That's the end. You say goodbye and they go to the husband's house, and that is it. And think about it this way: in those cultures, if a woman does decide to separate or get a divorce, she's not going to have any support, So sometimes many women continue to tolerate abuse, disrespect. I mean, it may not be overtly where there's beating, or sometimes there are these emotional abuse that goes on for years and years and years, and you tolerate it because you don't want to make your mom and dad angry, because you don't have any other place to go but your mom and dad's, and they've closed their doors already. So what do you do at that time? Fact of the matter is, no matter what culture, no matter where we're from, nobody has the right to abuse you. Nobody has the right to lay hands on you. Nobody has the right to pass smart comments. Absolutely not. No matter what relationship. So ultimately, it is understanding what is my right as a human being. Okay. And does that mean that means you're going to just leave everything and walk out the door and saying, I'm a woman and I'm going to... No, it doesn't work like that. But I think it starts from your heart, where you do believe that I am worth every piece of respect this world's going to give me. That's it. And then even if you live in that house where your spouse is being, pardon my French, a jerk, you still then know how to make it work for you, not for anybody else. So,
Thank you so much, Dr. Shakir. We really appreciate your insight and expertise around how this unhealthy relationships unfold. And a lot of times it is a progression over time, right? A lot of times you don't start dating, they're not hitting you on the first date, they're not calling you names on the first date. It takes time, and sometimes it takes a long time to realize they're in tricky situations. And I think this is a wonderful time for us to pass the baton to Miss Olivia Ray Leonard. She is a representative from Haven, which is located in Oakland County, and she's going to help us equip us with some community resources for folks who are listening that might be in the situation that Dr. Shakir was speaking of. So thank you so much, Miss Olivia. Pass the baton.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I love any opportunity to get into the community and connect anyone who needs these resources with them. I work with Haven of Oakland County, and we are Oakland County's primary comprehensive agency that supports survivors of intimate partner violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking. Haven provides a lot of different services for survivors, and that is really based on our empowerment philosophy. So if you speak with anyone that does the work that we do, we rely heavily on empowerment. And just like it was said before, every survivor has different needs. Every survivor is coming from a different place. And we want to be able to recognize that survivors need different services from us. So speaking specifically to the services Haven provides, we operate a shelter. We're probably most known for our shelter on site. We're specifically designated as a domestic violence and sexual assault shelter for people who are fleeing immediate risk of harm. So it's quite a small shelter. It operates a little bit different than a general homeless shelter would work. Our survivors, when they come in, they are welcome to bring their kids with them. They have a room that they get to stay with their family. They're also assigned a caseworker who helps them through whatever it is that they need. A lot of survivors that come to stay in shelter are often those survivors that have really no other resources. So as many of us can imagine, probably staying in a shelter wouldn't be our first choice. We would try to stay with friends, family, try to find other housing for ourselves. So often when someone comes to our shelter, it's really their last available option. And with respect to that, we partner each incoming survivor with a caseworker who helps them with their employment needs or to help establish more stable housing. Oftentimes we do a lot of safety planning around co-parenting with an abuser. But those services aren't just limited to the people that stay in our shelter. We also operate a whole host of different services like therapy and counseling services, court advocacy. So that one I think is very important because a lot of survivors that do choose to report the abuse, or even if they didn't choose to report the abuse and then all of a sudden they find themselves in the midst of this criminal case that they're being asked to testify and participate, oftentimes the court system moves very fast. There's a lot of jargon, there's a lot of stress involved, and for those that are already experiencing trauma, that can be so overwhelming to talk about the worst things that are happening to you in a room full of strangers. So our court advocates are very necessary to go with the survivors. They physically sit with them in the courtroom. They prepare them for what testimony looks like. They also follow up after court hearings to talk about what happened, to debrief, to explain a little bit more of that court process. We're also very lucky at Haven that in addition to those amazing services, we also have a team of nurses that operate on site. We have a clinic that we're able to use, just a single bed clinic, but we operate a sane nursing program, which allows our nurses to do those forensic exams. So oftentimes we see that coming after a sexual assault. But maybe lesser known is that there are a lot of situations where a forensic exam might be needed after domestic violence. Most notably, strangulation is a huge issue when we're talking about intimate partner violence. Strangulation can be deadly very easily, and there are often sometimes risks to someone's health for months after the strangulation has occurred that they may not be aware of. So our nurses do a wonderful job of educating patient survivors about their risks and collecting that evidence, providing that medical care. And then, of course, I have to mention our prevention education team. That's where I work at Haven and where I'm housed. Our mission in Haven is to assist survivors and also to prevent and eradicate domestic violence and sexual assault. So my job, kind of the ins and outs, my team works with a variety of audiences. So I come to events like this to speak about domestic violence in the community. We also do a lot of education for children, K through 12, college students. We have curriculum that we adapt to be age appropriate, where we talk about things like bodily autonomy, saying no, having boundaries. As kids get older, we talk about things like healthy friendships and healthy relationships, developing relationship expectations. And then when we speak with college students, we start talking about sexual assault and bystander intervention, what it looks like to support someone else who might be experiencing these things. Our goal is to educate survivors and those who will at some point unfortunately become survivors over the course of their life, so that they feel very equipped to, like it was mentioned before, to understand their value as a human being, to recognize what a healthy relationship looks like before they even start dating, before they get in relationships. And also we want to make sure that we start taking the stigma and shame out of being a survivor. I think so many survivors don't speak up, or if they do, they feel that it's their fault, that they brought on the abuse. And we always say, shame thrives in silence. And so a lot of what we do is encouraging survivors to speak. We operate a wonderful survivor speakers bureau where we get survivors out to the community to speak about their experiences. And yeah, really the root of our team is working on that eradication piece, because I do think that will happen when we can get more education out into the community, and we have a community full of people that have a really strong, healthy understanding of what relationships should and should not look like. They're mentally healthy, and they understand what they deserve in relationships. And I would just say that the best way for anyone to get connected with Haven, if you are interested in reaching out, is by going to our website. It's haven-oakland.org, or calling our crisis line, which is 248-334-1274. And that number is answered 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You can access someone to support you if you're in crisis, or if you just need someone to talk to or learn more about domestic violence.
Thank you so much, Olivia. We really appreciate you sharing all the great things happening at Haven and the community, the provision and comfort and resources and empowerment that you and your team are doing. It's very important. So thank you. Thank you for what you're doing. We are going to turn to Chaplain Dorset, and he is going to be lifting us up with the spiritual wellness and healthy relationships, and he's going to share wisdom in that realm. So,
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
thank you.
I'll begin by saying that the information that has been shared here has been most valuable in regards to the wholeness of relationships. And what I mean by that is when you consider relationships and what they look like, there is a spiritual component to that. Now, the spiritual component is important because I'm reminded that if two people can't walk together, it's difficult for them to maneuver. And what does that simply mean? That means that there has to be a foundation or a sense of footage there where there's some sense of commonality, whether that's the spiritual aspect of it or just your faith or even building upon the progressiveness of your culture in regards to how you were reared. I know for myself, it is amazing. Someone once told me that relationships don't work, people do. So what does that mean? That means that you have to put in that work in order to nurture your spirituality. For most of us, I know my days oftentimes start very, very early. So it's the ability to get up and have that quiet time, guarding your space, having those boundaries. And guess what? You can do that by yourself or you can do that with your partner. It's always encouraged to do it with each other because it gives you guys a sense of understanding of where you are. And let's just face it, life is noisy. It's very noisy, whether it's the kids, whether it's your career, whether it's just trying to have a better understanding. That communication aspect of each other is very important. And I think most times what happens is in an unhealthy relationship, what's being said? What's being said and what's not being said. There's a difference between listening and being heard. And oftentimes what we do is we find ourselves saying things, maybe not verbally, but we say it through our moods. We say it through our actions. And I think that part of it is important because when you're looking at all the life stressors, where do you come in? How do you digress a little bit? How do you take it down a little bit? And it's oftentimes going to that higher power. And let's just face it, I deal with an array of individuals throughout the day. And some of them have oftentimes told me if it wasn't for my spirituality, I don't know if I could keep this together. So why is the spiritual component important? First of all, there has to be that communication piece. Secondly, I believe it has to be the ability for two people to come together who can share their values. They can share where they are in retrospect to where they're going, but at the end to be able to appreciate what each brings to the table with respect of building that sense of camaraderie. And that's the important aspect of it, not only to be able to see each other, but to value and hear each other. One of the things that's pretty a part of my own spiritual belief is the power of prayer. What do we do in those situations where things tend to unravel? Do we go to our friends? Do we go to Facebook? Do we go to social media? Or do we just have that peace? Peace is important because when you seek peace, you can tend to hear better. You can tend to listen better. I don't necessarily need to call someone. Maybe we can go together in prayer or either just maybe go out. I know from my church, because I pastor a church outside of the VA, we oftentimes have prayer on Wednesday evenings. It's a place where you can come together to be able to share your concerns with the community, but guess what? With one another. So when we look at this whole aspect of what we have here at the table, I think it's important for us to realize is that in those healthy relationships, it's the ability to be able to understand, to be able to be heard, to be able to be listened and valued, but most of all, to be able to incorporate your spirituality in there that gives you a sense of foundation.
Right. That is awesome. So, what I wanted to add before we kind of open it up for questions. So, I did mention that I am the vice chair of SAFE organization. So, we felt that it was very necessary to have this community conversation. So, as I look at the presence of domestic violence cases that are on like YouTube, it's overwhelming. So, as stated, this community conversation very necessary. So, I just would like to provide a moment if you or someone you know have been affected by domestic violence to say their name. Say your name or say their name out loud or simply write it out. And from that, we will begin our questions.
Thank you, Dr. Floyd, and thank you, Chaplain Dorset, for all of your input and your valuable perspective. We really appreciate it. Okay, so we do have some questions. So the first one I can bring to anybody or everybody. If each one has your perspective on it, feel free. How can someone recognize the early signs of an unhealthy relationship before it escalates into a larger issue?
So, my response to that would be you feel uncomfortable. When you start feeling uncomfortable, just merely from a conversation, is it the tone? Is it what's being said? Is it going against just your ethics? So, if you get to a point that you feel that you have to not really compromise, but more so is it in a biased way? It has to be your partner's perspective. That would be my response to that.
Yeah, I think if in order to have these very difficult and uncomfortable conversations that are germane with intimate partner violence and domestic violence, we have to understand that unfortunately there are individuals with just some very unhealthy perceptions of women in general. And I know that I have been in spaces and places to hear these individuals, and I'm keeping it to just young men right now, and just how they refer to the individual on the other end of the telephone or in person, and things of that nature. And you ask yourself time and time again, how could that individual, now here's an individual, I'm gonna just make me point. You hear these young men who are incarcerated call home, and the person answered the phone and you hear how they're talking to them. And then you ask yourself, to Dr. Shakira's point, how do you keep picking up the phone to be subjected to this? How do you keep picking up the phone to be subjected to this? And to your point, Dr. Floyd, when I look at some of the horrific, tragic situations that women are subjected to, at the end of the day, Chaplain Dorset, people who are married are not related to each other. Mm-hmm. So when we ask ourselves, how could they do this to another person? When those emotions come into play, Dr. Shakur, this is somebody I'm not related to. Mm-hmm. So at that point, they become a stranger, mm-hmm. in essence. Mm-hmm. And that's why we can do this to an individual, because we're not related to them. So when you recognize, I think to a point, again, going back to just being mindful, to your point, to Dr. Shakur's point, being mindful, know your value. Mm-hmm. Know your value and know your self-worth.
I just want to add one thing to that sometimes it happens where certain behaviors become generational, or it becomes part of what is expected. And sometimes it happens where a person may be in an abusive relationship where that is all she knows. Mm-hmm. She's seen her parents mm-hmm. in a similar relationship. Mm-hmm. She's in a similar relationship. Her children now. I mean, that kind of cycle repeats itself. And those are situations where it's hard to recognize signs because that's all you know. Bottom line is, violence is unacceptable. No matter what. Even if you see a parent in a violent relationship, you see violence in the community, disrespecting, bullying, all of that. Just because it is there doesn't make it right. So that by itself, and no matter what, you're worth every bit of respect. No matter what circumstances you're in, you're worth that respect. Just because you're a human being, nothing else. Just because you're a human being. So
That's a beautiful point. And to echo what you said, I think that so much of this is hard to pin down. It's hard to name those red flags because abuse is as diverse as humans are, and it looks different depending on the relationship. When I speak with survivors that oftentimes have experienced abuse and are re-entering dating and are really trying to look for, what do I look for is often the question we get. And we do have there's some research on this, and some of the things that we do see as red flags. Again, big caveat because it doesn't always necessarily mean it'll lead to abuse, but things like intense jealousy, especially jealousy that then tries to control the partner. So, I don't want you to wear that. I don't think you should talk to this person, that sort of thing, that early signs of isolation. I think another one that I always talk about with survivors is paying attention to how someone takes accountability. I think oftentimes people that choose to abuse have a really hard time taking accountability, acknowledging when they're wrong, when they've misstepped. They often will twist reality or deny that things happened altogether to avoid apologizing or taking accountability for what they've done. And sometimes those are really hard things to see very early in a relationship, but I do think that paying attention to those things can sometimes help us see people that are more inclined towards making the choice to abuse in relationships.
Thank you so much. Appreciate all of your thoughtful replies. Question specifically for Chaplain Dorset. If someone is recovering from spiritual abuse being wielded over them in a relationship, how would you encourage them to help heal?
Yeah. So first of all, no one should be the recipient of any spiritual abuse. First of all, what I would do is I would suggest that individual speaks to someone within the context of their belief system, whether that's a pastor, myself, a chaplain, someone who can, first of all, listen to their concern and to be able to give them some more spiritual encouragement. When you find someone spiritually abusing you, usually it's the person. There's a question, first of all, why and where is this coming from? And once you identify that, could it be a possible opportunity for it to be reconciled? Maybe so. Or there may be an opportunity for other measures to be taken in regards to removing yourself from that type of abuse. Abuse is, just listening to the panel here, when you think about abuse, going back to the earlier question about the signs, all of us have a conscience, and that conscience tells us when something is not right, so those signs can be seen. And oftentimes what we do is we begin to have this different type of language, and that language usually begins with you, so you're the problem as opposed to I, coming back to the Dr. Shakur in regards to taking that responsibility. So I would suggest maybe speaking to someone within their faith community, trusting in that individual to see what would be the next step moving forward.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that speaks to some of the isolation stuff that we were talking about earlier too. It still encourages that community and sense of staying within your values system and not abandoning that in order to save the potentially abusive relationship, right? So yeah, no, totally appreciate that. Thank you. Okay, for Dr. Floyd and Dr. Scott, and anybody else who might have something to add, how can people with different communication styles avoid conflict and work together to better understanding?
Well,
that's why I picked up I need to.
But, that's really interesting because I know when I told my wife that I was going to be in this panel, she was like, "Well, I know I got to pay attention to this." So I know she's listening. So and because we're polar opposites, and you have to find that happy medium. So, and I just heard something recently that really resonated with me. So let's just say that you have two people, and one is always vibrating at a 10, and the other one is always vibrating at a 5. Well, there's some variance there. So you have to either come down to the 5 or go up to the 10. But let's say that's not your style. So what you're going to have to do is hopefully you'll meet in between and both of you can get to the 7. And there's still some stability. There's still some communication. There's still some respect, because now you respect the person coming down to where you are, and that person appreciates you coming up to where they are. And here's the thing. You're not going to always agree. You're not going to always agree. And I know my wife and I have said plenty of times, you know what? Okay, well, I see you just see this differently than me. It doesn't mean that other person is right or wrong. It just means that we just see these things differently. But we can still have that healthy respect and understand that just because that person doesn't see things that you do doesn't necessarily make them wrong. The problem comes in any relationship is when we try to impose our thoughts on the other person. And to Dr. Shakira's point, and everybody here, Chaplain Dorsett, Olivia, when you try to force the individual to see things, we become rigid and we have no flexibility and we're no longer malleable. Then that relationship becomes very, very stagnant. So, like they always said, happy wife, happy life. So, you want to keep them smiling.
Yes. And I'm going to echo just a little bit. I would say it's the accountability and that communication style. I'm going to speak personally, and I'm going to speak from like a woman perspective. A lot of times we speak from emotions. And as we're speaking from emotions, sometimes, it's like a little rise that we get. And again, it's very important, the respect between the two. So, respecting that, as a woman, sometimes, we speak from our emotions, and sometimes from a male, maybe, it's a little masculine, and just understanding each other's style, but always, keeping that respect.
Awesome. Thank you. Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt your plan. No, okay, great. Okay, for Dr. Shakir, what are some signs that we can notice if someone is reacting to a trauma from their past rather than the present situation in a relationship?
I think it would depend, because trauma builds on itself. So if there is history of trauma already there, and then there is new trauma happening, it does build on itself, and sometimes depending on how frequent those adversities are happening, sometimes there's no boundary to each event. Okay, so the difference is really in terms of reacting to the trauma. There would be a different if there's, let's say, just one trauma that we would say maybe index trauma that has caused certain reactions, whether it is hyperarousal, where I'm getting startled easily, having nightmares, having flashbacks, being scared, having thoughts that are sometimes irrational beliefs about ourselves, shame and guilt, all of that. So sometimes it is easier to recognize that, okay, this is what happened and this is a result of that, as opposed to individuals who have had multiple adversities that many times some individuals who have been through domestic violence, they have also been in other abusive situations, whether it is interpersonal violence or other adversities. It's hard to differentiate because it's one human body, one human brain. So,
and yeah, just to extend that conversation, Dr. Shakir, as you just mentioned, people really don't understand that trauma does build on itself, as you just stated. Whenever you encounter a new trauma, you go back to that old trauma and you take bits and pieces and fragments from that old trauma and you bring it all to the forefront, to your point. So now we run into the problem of transference of trauma. So now if we have been in that past relationship and this individual engages in a behavior or articulates or tone or inflection, as Dr. Floyd has mentioned earlier, now that individual sees that other individual before them now and may respond, have that somatic physiological trauma response and not even aware of it. So I think open communication and honesty may help to thwart that at some point in time. But you make a great point, Dr. Shakira, that and I tell people this all the time, that every time we encounter trauma, we go back to all our previous trauma, grab that, and now we bring that to the present situation.
And sometimes we will bring it to the present situation where there is no threat, there is no danger. It is our perception of the danger and threat and that is where, again, in new relationships, then having that open communication, as Dr. Scott said, is very important.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, a little bit of a shift to Ms. Ray Leonard. What advice do you have for someone who wants to help a loved one in an unhealthy or dangerous relationship but doesn't know where to start?
That's a great question because I think for all of us, whether we've experienced interpersonal violence or not, it can be really jarring and really difficult to be a support person and to be on the sidelines, especially if your loved one is in a situation where they maybe have left multiple times and gone back multiple times. It can be really frustrating to be a support person. And I think that isn't always said as much as it should be. The place that I always come back to is the word empowerment. I think when we talk about working with survivors, that really is the best thing that we can provide to them. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, when we look at what abuse does to somebody, it takes away their autonomy. It takes away their control over their own life. And so when we step in as a support person and start trying to control, we continue to take away that autonomy. When we start telling them what they need to do and giving them directives, we also don't want somebody to become, enmeshed in this pattern of just listening to other people and what other people want them to do, because that then opens them up to more vulnerability of the next relationship they enter into, also being a relationship where someone is trying to control them. I think that providing that empowerment, and that can look a lot of different ways, but for me, I always think about putting the survivor in the driver's seat. They get to drive the car and choose when they want to leave, how they want to leave, under what circumstances, and how they want to speak about the abuse, who they want to disclose the abuse to. I think that it can't really be stated enough that sometimes just having the role of that support person there and knowing that that is always someone that survivor can speak to and confide in, go to for support, go to talk about safety planning options, that's huge, because abuse also isolates people, and abusers thrive on the concept of people leaving that survivor's life so that they have fewer and fewer people. So remaining consistent and providing that empowerment. And so to that point, I think the second thing is just time. And I know that's so hard when you're watching someone that you love suffer, and you want so much better for them. But if I've learned one thing working with survivors is that the arc is long for a lot of survivors. Like we've been talking about, it brings up our childhood, it brings up our trauma, our self-worth, and it can be a long process to extricate yourself from that, just emotionally, let alone financially or with custody of shared children and all those other things that go into breaking off a relationship. And we know that the most unsafe time for somebody in an abusive relationship is during or just after they've left the relationship. And so going back to the empowerment piece, that's why, one of the many reasons why it's so important to empower the survivor to make that choice themselves. Because if they're making a choice to leave and that choice is potentially going to bring about more danger, they need to make that choice on their own, and that can't be made by someone else's influence. And then just that patience. We always use the analogy of being the lighthouse. We're there to provide the light when you need it. When you don't need us, that's fine. When you do need us, we're here for you and we're not going anywhere. And I think that can be a very stabilizing message to send to somebody that you love who is probably experiencing a lot of instability in their relationship, to just be that stable person for them.
Thank you so much. I think, yeah, those are good. I think that is often a tough spot. Like, right, I don't want to like force somebody or make them think that I'm also trying to control them or scare them away. And so I think it means so much to have that empowerment behind it. Like, you are making your decisions, and like, this is, I'm here for you, and this is also, yours to steer. It is empowering. So thank you so much. Okay, so back to some like healthy relationship, less abuse, more into general relationship questions of building trust. What are some effective ways to rebuild trust after it has been broken in a relationship, whether it's a partner, family member, or friend?
I think it is, again, the same way as a person gets in any relationship, whether abusive or not. We learn by getting in another relationship, and having realistic expectations from them. I think the first step, though, is really understanding who we are as people. Because one of the things that an abusive relationship does is it leads to a lot of shame and guilt inside of the person who is abused. And that takes away that confidence that the person is even worth healthy attention or healthy relationship, friendship, support. So the first thing many times, one of the things that happens in addition to everything we talked about is we lose ourselves. So before we even get in another relationship, in order to even rebuild that sixth sense, even to understand a new relationship, I think there should be a journey of self-discovery. This is who I am, and actually reestablishing that identity of self. Because, many times abused individuals have lived as this person's daughter, this person's son, this person's wife, this person's husband, the children's parent. But then who am I then? And I think understanding who I am, understanding what are my limits, what are my boundaries, will help me have realistic expectations from other people, which will mean that I will go in intentionally and not just using my emotions. And it just helps. Does that mean that all of a sudden I'm psychic and I know the other person's gonna abuse me? No. But at least I will have more self-esteem and sense of self-worth that when I'm going in, I'm not gonna tolerate that abuse. So
Yeah, that's beautiful. I think that the emphasis on trusting self too,
Yes.
right? And building that up. Provides so much more freedom in a relationship, really, and
Precisely.
the communication skills and all those things. Thank you. Anyone else want to add to that?
Yeah, I just real quick. Go ahead. Jimmy.
No, I was just going to say, Doc makes a very good point. I think there is a vulnerability piece in all of that. I oftentimes hear this on my unit, dealing with mental health veterans, that I've been scarred so much, I don't want to trust anyone. And I think that's a key factor. In order for you to build that trust, you're going to have to become vulnerable again in those key areas where the trauma may have been the greatest. Someone once told me, as we talk about relationships, whether it's the opposite sex, male or female, when an individual gets into a relationship and they've been hurt, oftentimes you hear this cliche that all men or all women are dogs. And someone made a very profound point. He said that can't possibly be true because you don't know all women. And I thought about that. And I think once we oftentimes hold that guard up, so to speak, it's difficult to allow someone to come back in. But that same guardrail will oftentimes cause us to lose out if we don't open up again. And is it easy? Of course not. But there has to be those boundaries where you can say, you know what, maybe I'll try this step by step.
And to your point, Chaplain Dorsett, we talk about this trust piece. I just heard about a month ago, I was in some space, and I heard a judge I was in veteran treatment court, and the judge was talking to a veteran, and she said, trust comes in drips, but it leaves in buckets. And I thought that was so apropos. And when you talk about rebuilding trust, there has to be an intentionality component to it. we have to be intentional, and not just for the person who's seeking to rebuild that trust, but if I want you to trust me, you have to give that person something to trust. And a lot of times, the person who's seeking that trust actually is forgiveness. Oftentimes, is forgiveness. Then you have to go to that person who's been harmed or wronged or wounded and have to ask them, what do you need to see from me to let you know that I'm trying to earn, not win, because it may have some sense of trickery to that when we say win, to earn your trust back. And I think when you can have those dialogues, that can be very uncomfortable, to your point, Chaplain Dorsett, because when we breached that trust barrier with someone who we love, with someone who loves us, they're wounded. And I can tell you from my personal experience in my marriage that those things take time.
Yes.
They take time, they take intentionality, and they take a trust on both the giver and receiver. So I'm gonna have to stop and get some flowers.
What I wanted to add, what comes to mind is I just look at, we are raised differently. We are geared differently. We have different morals and values. So when you are establishing a healthy relationship, it's about what tools do you need to bring to that foundation. You know, just having accountability to say, hey, I'm going to put that effort forth and whatever tools is needed for the two of us to, you know, really complete this unit. And I think that's very important.
Thank you so much. I love that this is reiterating so many of the things that you all already talked about and giving some examples. I think it's beautiful, and it really, we're trying to connect all these different aspects of relationships and self. It really pulls it all together. So I really appreciate that. Okay, another question. I think this kind of comes with a bit of maybe that's not quite the right word, an assumption that people make within relationships. So here's the question. What are some simple ways that someone can begin healing from trauma while still being in a relationship? And I think this comes, I often hear like, oh, well, you can't be loved or love someone else unless you love yourself and you've already been healed, or there's this expectation of like, oh, well, you need to go into a relationship as your best self. And so I think this is, speaking to that of like, okay, how can I heal within a relationship? Yeah. So it was directed toward Dr. Shakir, but truly anyone can speak on it too.
I think the first step is recognizing that there is something to heal. Many times an abusive relationship may go on and the person who is traumatized does not even realize that there is, many times while I'm working with patients, whether they're adults, children, the first step is really helping them understand that what happened was not right. So I think that is the first step, that recognizing that there are certain aspects of the relationship that are not healthy, and that no, I do not deserve this kind of a response from my partner. And then from then is really realistically looking at things, whether it is communication, whether it is whether it is verbal communication, whether it is other aspects of life, taking care of kids, responsibilities, chores, whatever. Really understanding that what are my realistic expectations from this relationship, okay? And then intentionally self-care, okay? Many times that guilt and shame in an abusive relationship is so strong that even in learning to be intentional about self-care takes a while, because every time I'm trying to do something good for myself, I'm telling myself I'm not worth it. So, and that is really where you then start. I just want to point out that sometimes it does happen where the dysfunction has gone on for such a long time that a person may feel, and let's talk about the person who's been traumatized. She or he may feel that if I start taking care of myself, I start looking at things realistically, we won't have a path together. And sometimes in a relationship, this does happen where years of dysfunction go on, and there is this, sort of mutually, there's this dysfunction being kept. And a point comes where you're standing at a fork that if I make changes, if I start eating healthy, if I lose weight, if I start working, I won't be feeding the dysfunction. Then what's going to happen? Will I be alone? Because now the past 10 years, my identity has been the wife of this person and mom of this children and so in the community. But now if I start doing better, I will no longer be feeding into this dysfunction. And what do I do? And I think that many times it comes to us as providers as well, that responsibility to let them know that if you are different, you will find different people. You should not be compromising your health and stay in the dysfunction. You do deserve to be healthy, whether it is emotionally, physically, spiritually, in whatever way possible. And either your partner will choose the way you are, and maybe you may start a new journey, or that's that's where the fork is, and you may choose another route. So.
And just to echo that, I think in any healthy relationship, there's usually two people coming in with trauma, with baggage. It's hard to work through, and any relationship brings that stuff to the surface, and it requires working through together. But just to echo exactly what you said, I think that when we talk to like young people about entering into healthy relationships, one thing that I always like to talk about is that your trauma is going to come up in the relationship, but in a healthy relationship, your partner should be helping you with that journey, supporting you through that journey. They can't do the work for you, but being there with you and doing their part to work on their own trauma as well. And just like you said, I think if it's a relationship where you are continually being triggered, your trauma is continually being brought to the surface, and your partner is not your partner in that and your advocate in that, it really can sometimes come down to the question of, is this actually a healthy relationship? Because a healthy relationship should bring us peace. And yes, it brings up all these other things too, but it should be a collaboration of both people trying to heal together, not aggravate each other's trauma.
Great, thank you. This might be our last question. Directed at Ms. Ray Leonard, but could be for anyone. What are some misconceptions about domestic abuse and seeking help that prevent people from reaching out? Maybe this was already talked about broadly, but could be reviewed.
Yeah, I think that one of the biggest misconceptions I think that we have as a culture is who experiences abuse and what it looks like. I think whether we talk about it or not, I think there are a lot of assumptions about the neighborhoods where domestic violence happens, the types of people that are in abusive relationships. And I think that leaves a lot of survivors feeling like they're not part of the conversation. We know that abuse happens at all income levels, with all racial and ethnic backgrounds, in all geographic locations. It really is about dysfunction and abuse in the relationship, and it is not caused by any particular type of identity or type of relationship. I think a great example of that is we often assume that abusive relationships only happen in heterosexual relationships. And when we talk about it in such a way, it leaves a lot of people feeling like they don't even factor into the conversation. And if they are experiencing abuse, that there's not a resource for me. Why would I go to a place where I don't see myself reflected? And I think to that end, another big misconception is how survivors act. We assume that survivors are going to be very timid, very traumatized, very sad, that they'll present in a certain type of way. And in my experience, I have worked with many survivors who are angry, justifiably so. They maybe feel frustrated. They may have really complicated feelings about their abuser. And I think when we start narrowing what it means to be a survivor to a specific type of response or a specific type of person, we leave a lot of people out of the conversation, and they don't want to reach out for help when they don't see themselves being represented and being welcomed at the table.
I think you have to, to your point, I think you have to be careful of masking, so to speak. So in my context, you have a lot of individuals who are wrapped up in their identity. So they live in the right neighborhoods, they drive the right car, their children go to parochial schools, but yet they're internally hemorrhaging, because of the hurt and the pain. So I think we should pay attention to the person. I had someone who reached out to me this week, and she said, the fact that I actually admitted that I needed the help was the first step moving forward. And this is an individual who is well off. So I think it's just paying attention to the individual and just really communicating, is everything okay? Not trying to impose or, overstep my boundaries, but just want to make sure that you are okay. Going back to Doc's point, she said something that is just a high on my bar for me: self-care. Self-care is not selfish; it's necessary. It is necessary.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much. We have a question from our live stream chat here, directed at Dr. Scott. Back when we were talking about trust and building up trust in relationships after hurt, does the trust ever really come back?
Does the trust really ever come back? Yes, trust can come back, and people have to understand that when you rebuild trust, it has to have certain things in place. There's no trust without vulnerability, and if you're going to trust, you're going to have to be vulnerable. There's no love without risk. So if you say that you want to trust someone again, then you have to be willing to first of all, identify the barriers that are preventing you from trusting, number one, and be honest and verbalize and articulate that. Because you cannot allow a person to be intentional on trying to get your trust back if you're only going to allow your trust to reach a certain level. You can't trust without conditions. You can't trust with conditions. You can't love with parameters. So at some point in time, you're going to have to make yourself vulnerable. Now, there's no certain limit or process in that. But I think if you don't have the ability, this is my personal perception now, if a person doesn't have the willingness and the honesty to trust, they can never fully love, because they go hand in glove. They are inextricably linked with one another. So that would be my answer to that question.
And Doc, just to add into that, it's almost as if you can't really live or be yourself in the relationship.
Absolutely not.
Because there's something there that will always come up if something is triggered.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Especially if you're looking for it.
Absolutely.
Because we have, and I say this all the time, and I'll be real quick because I know we got to wrap up. We have a radar with our feelings. And that radar only seeks out information that reinforces what we already believe. So if I believe I don't trust you, I don't care what you do. I'm going to go find the information that's validating what I already believe. So therein lies the rub.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I think another theme that I'm hearing in a lot of our comments and perspectives is this decision-making skill, right? A lot of relationships we feel is emotional and passion charged, and so much of this is logical decision-making and acknowledging things and finding things in ourselves to be more practical, quote unquote, about. And I think that, it's beautiful in so many ways. So thank you. We're right at the end of our time. So any final thoughts before we sign out for the evening?
So I would just like to say as a conclusion for the group, I would like to thank the panelists. This was a very awesome community conversation. As stated, much needed, much necessary. Also, for those who joined the live stream, thank you for taking the opportunity to support this community conversation, because there's other things that you could have did tonight. And all those that supported this community conversation that's in the background that you don't see. We appreciate everyone.
Great. Thank you so much for being here and for your expertise and input. And hope you all have a good night. And everyone at home have a good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
I'm Ken Massey. I'm the current chair of Farmington Safe. This evening's event has been brought to you by Farmington Safe, and I hope that you enjoyed the presentation and the subsequent discussion. Let me tell you a little bit about Farmington Safe. I'm Ken Massey. I'm the current chair of Farmington Safe. This evening's event has been brought to you by Farmington Safe, and I hope that you enjoyed the presentation and the subsequent discussion. Let me tell you a little bit about Farmington Safe. It was formed in 2011 by resolution of the City Councils of Farmington and Farmington Hills in order to improve the mental health of our community. We are a community that cares. The organization is composed of a group of volunteers from the community with one mission in mind. Through increasing awareness, Farmington Safe's mission is to foster compassionate and supportive community dedicated to promoting mental well-being and thus preventing suicide. The model that Farmington Safe used to build is adaptable to any community, and it has been very effective. We've seen in the communities of Farmington Hills, a reduction in the number of deaths by suicide and an increase in number of people that have been requesting help early. How? Well, we had some goals. We want to overcome the issue of denial, be able to talk about difficult subjects. We want to connect people with resources. We want to destigmatize the request for help. And that overall results in connecting people with resources before they need them. It also increases awareness and the information that's disseminated out to our community. It all comes down to communication. Again, it all comes down to communication. And how do we do that? Through community conversations like the one that we are doing now. We also put out resources, either printed resources, event programming, news articles, other things that have been organized by Farmington Safe in these community conversations, increase community awareness. We've done resource fairs. We do material for the internet on mental health. We've actually done community conversations on substance abuse and its effect on mental health, trauma, its effect on mental health, abusive relationships, coping with the aftermath of a suicide attempt, and many, many others. But what I hope you take away from this is that in a community that cares, we can make a difference. And in order to make that difference a reality, we have to know that there's an issue. We have to have information. We have to know what to look for. We have to have the courage to ask challenging questions. And if we can do all those things, we know what to do. But bottom line, we have to be able to talk about it. You can make a difference in your community. And as I said, this model that we've used is adaptable for specific communities. Our funding source, we have a 501c3, the Graham Smith Memorial Fund for Suicide Prevention, that's funded that is held at Huntington Bank in Farmington Hills. But where we get our money from, we have a softball tournament every year. We bring the community out. It's always the first Saturday in August, and that is where we raise the funding. We have zero public money. It's all done through philanthropy and in-kind support. So again, if you wish to support this work, it would go to the Graham Smith Memorial Fund for Suicide Prevention at Huntington Bank.